Good morning, everyone, and welcome to When Culture Gets Culty. I am so excited for today's conversation. I'm Allison DeFlorio, and equally excited to have with me Elena Van Kirk, principal here at. And really, it was Elena's brainchild to do this webinar series. I'll call it a series. There are two parts to this, but it all started as a conversation, Elena, a couple of months ago, when Elena had done some research around the tactics and techniques used by cults to indoctrinate followers, attract followers. And at the same time, she's thinking about the work that she does with our clients around processes and structures on how to attract and retain talent. And then you add into this mix the evolution of the changing relationship between the employer-employee relationship and the blending lines between work and life. And we just thought, this begs a conversation that we need to share with people. So we appreciate all of you tuning in and joining us in this conversation. A couple of housekeeping tips for today's presentation. This is being recorded, so your phones will be on mute. However, your questions are important to us. So as you have them, please feel free to type them in and we will do our best to get to those questions. And certainly, if we aren't able to address questions you may have, both Elena and I are available after this session. We will be sending out a link to the recording post this session. And part two, which will share a sneak peek of what we'll be covering in part two, will be taking place in the next 30 or 60 days. So we'll let you know when that takes place. So before we get started, I want to welcome back those of you that have attended previous webinars, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. If you are joining us for the first time, I want to share a little bit about, we are a Philadelphia-based consulting firm with areas of expertise in human resources, in diversity, equity, inclusion, belongingness, and leadership development. And we really look at our work through the intersection of the three of those, as we believe that all of those are key drivers of your talent strategy. And again, I'm so excited to have with me Elena Van Kirk. Elena, do you want to share a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks, Allison. Good morning, everyone. I'm Elena Van Kirk, principal here at. I have been in the HR space for almost 15 years, but my degree is in psychology. And so I've always been very interested in the dynamics of human behavior, and how this shows up in a lot of the work that we do with clients related to managing performance, the employee experience, talent development, and building inclusive cultures. So as Allison mentioned a couple of months ago, I came across some of the ideas and structures and research that we'll share with you today. And I think there's a lot of comparison to be drawn to some of the things that we're doing in the professional world. So really excited to share this conversation with you all.
Great. And I think it's fair to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Elena, that we are not here to suggest that the culture in your organization is culty. What we are here to perhaps share with you is ways of thinking about your culture, perhaps a little bit differently, given what has changed so dramatically over the last few years, and really making sure that you are making the necessary adjustments, as we do in cultures around the world, to be relevant to today's workplace. So we're going to talk a little bit about culture. We're going to talk about this concept of fear versus trust, and how there's a very fine line at times there. We're going to talk about recruiting into your culture and thinking about how you bring people in. What messages are you sharing with them intentionally or unintentionally as they join you? As Elena alluded to, we're going to talk about identifying structures of control. And then lastly, leave you with some specific steps to deprogram your culture. Okay. So, a little context setting for the conversation. It's fair to say that there's been some shifts in the workplace. Certainly, when we talk about culture, we speak about it. There are healthy cultures, there are positive cultures, there are unhealthy cultures or toxic cultures, cultures where people not only do not feel welcome, but they fear every day whether they're going to be losing their job or put out in front of their peers in some unhealthy way for perhaps a mistake that they made. And then there's this borderline that, is it a healthy culture? Is it a little bit culty? Is the culture a little bit, you either conform to how we are and you are a fit, or you're just a little bit too different and not perhaps one of us? And when we think about the workplace in general and what has changed, where your culture fits on that continuum, healthy, unhealthy, culty, is really important. So, no surprise to anybody, about 4 years ago, the world stood still and we went from an employer-employee relationship where the employer held a lot of control and employees would do anything in rain, sleet, snow to get to the office and to be at their seat on time. And if they were late, they would be stressing about it. Or if they had to go to a doctor's appointment, they had to take an entire day off, as just a few of those examples. And then overnight, that changed. Overnight, many employees were now able to do that same job without that 2 hours of commute in the course of a day. They were able to be home to make dinner for their kids without being frantic and rushed. They were able to throw a load of laundry in during the course of a day without missing a meeting. And they had what we like to refer to as those pandemic epiphanies. Wow, I have more time in my day to do things that matter. And what was I thinking all this time, right? Now, in addition, well, now we have the return to work movement, right? So the pandemic is controlled right now. We're not concerned about that. And employers are saying, well, wait a minute, our culture is at risk. And we don't have a culture of innovation any longer because we don't have people in the office. And yet we have people saying that they're going back to the office to sit on Zoom calls with people who are a few desks away from them. The other thing that's changed is this kind of group think versus individual. There have been a lot of societal issues that have surfaced, and there's been a very kind of a negative social discourse. There's a lot of social activism that has now filtered into the workplace. So individual thought and individual expression has taken on a whole new meaning in the last few years. So you couple those together and you think about, okay, what are we driving? Are we driving culture? Are we driving control? And that's really where we're heading with our conversation today. I think some interesting statistics, and Elaine and I were talking about this just yesterday. There was a recent survey or recent report done by Gallup, I think it was the earlier part of this year, about the state of today's workplace. And just a couple of highlights that I think are worth talking about is, of these 5,000, 6,000 respondents, 85% of the responses related to 3 categories. And look at the percentages of those categories. 41% of the people who were asked if they could make one change at their current employer to make it a great workplace, what would it be? And it was around engagement and culture. And Elena, you were mentioning about the well-being. If you think about that piece of it, adding that 16% into it, you're well over 50% of respondents in a very recent survey stating that if we could change the culture, it would be a better place to work. So given that and thinking about that, we wanted to talk about or set the framework really for comparing this concept of how much control does your culture have, need, warrant, and what's the difference between high control groups and low control groups? So, Lena, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think cults are notorious for being high control groups and representing high control groups. And one thing we do want to preface here is that nothing on this slide, nothing in this presentation is a judgment or an opinion of Exude Human Capital, but merely a comparison of similar dynamics across different types of groups. So cults are innately high control groups. Not all high control groups are bad. If you think about some of the high control groups that we encounter in regular everyday life, high control groups live in a lot of different ways. So if we think about the military as a high control group for a very specific purpose, probably would not operate and be successful if it wasn't a high control group. Some of the other, more benign high control groups are things like homeowners association, where there are structure and rigid rules and regulations. Fraternities and sororities also tend to have very conformist structures and regulations and expectations for their members. And that's also how they get new members, right? Come be like us, join us. And multi-level marketing organizations have their own facets of control. There are just similarities between high control groups that are different than what we see in low control groups. So sports teams tend to be lower control groups. Think about the difference with a startup. An entrepreneurial organization, startup organizations tend to have far more autonomy and flexibility, not only in how they do the work, but also how they relate to each other. Small professional groups, think small pockets of attorneys or engineers or architects, tend to have more autonomy in how they work with clients, maybe how they bring in business and how they relate to each other as an organization.
Elena, I think it's interesting too, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work with clients. Take the startup, think about the tech giants in today's world. They were startups at one time with less control and allowing for innovation, and that was the sell to attracting talent. As they got larger, they had to start putting in more controls. And now you start seeing the Googles of the world and some of the other tech giants that are asking people to return to work. And they're getting more pushback from that very same group that at one point had started with them with less control. We see it with professional groups, small law firms that left large law firms because of the controls. And now they're smaller groups with with less control. However, as they grow, they start putting some of those controls back in place.
Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting, Allison, is that if you think about physicians who operate within a hospital setting, while there are controls in hospital settings, physicians also tend to have a decent amount of autonomy in how they treat their patients. And in some cases, the hours that they hold and things like that. schools, I think, also tend to be a place where there is a decent amount of flexibility and autonomy for teachers and educators in how I craft my lesson plans, and how I run my classroom as an educator. And so in those two independent settings, we tend to see less control. Again, these are broad generalizations. But Allison, you had shared with me a really interesting perspective that if you put those two together and think of medical students, right, who are in the education world, but also in the medical world, med students, that population really tends to exist in a relatively high control environment where the expectations for them are very high, and there's a lot of pressure to perform, behave, and think and tolerate that environment in a very specific way.
And that's an interesting term, tolerate. For those of you listening, you may have heard about some recent organizing activity of medical students. The expectation has been, well, it's just part of the process. You're going to work 24/7 for your entire resident period. And that's just what you need to do to cut your teeth to make it as a doc. Well, now the tide is shifting and people are saying, wait a minute. No, that's not, it doesn't have to be that way. And schools are going to be thinking about, hospitals are going to be thinking about, so how much of that really is relevant to the learning process and how much of that might need to be adjusted in order to make it a culture that's going to continue to attract talent into their environment.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest overarching differences between the groups on the left and the groups on the right is the autonomy that there is to decision making, as well as, how I, in the professional world, go about doing my job and managing my own responsibilities. So if you think about what does this really come down to in how much control are we placing on our employees versus how much autonomy are we enabling them to have? That balancing act is really all about control. And control in the professional world really comes down to that difference between fear versus trust. Do we trust them to make the decisions that we want to make and that will get us the outcomes that we're looking for? Or are we fearful that they won't, in which case we feel like we need to prescribe what those behaviors and decisions should look like?
And I think that's where it's been, it's so interesting to see the shift over the last few years. There were a number of employers at the outset of the pandemic that were believers that as soon as we are able, we will bring everybody back into the office. And when I asked leaders about that, a lot of it came down to a fear that people weren't going to be doing what I wanted them to do, what the leader wanted them to do. Over time, some leaders experienced increased productivity, or that reduced that fear, saying, okay, well, if we ensure that we're setting the right expectations and holding people accountable, it doesn't really matter where that work is done. Whereas in other organizations where perhaps expectations weren't being well set or communicated, and they started to see dips in productivity, or they started to hear the word on the street about quiet quitters, and are my people actually running other businesses out of their home and doing my job? The fear returned and the trust levels went down, and you started to see people bring people back. But what research is showing is that employers really aren't as in touch with what employees want or need. And that probably, Alina, correct me if I'm wrong, is best seen in some of the recruiting practices that we're seeing.
Absolutely. And so we are still seeing organizations who are recruiting for culture fit, and recruiting to identify candidates and new hires who are similar to other people themselves, maybe as hiring leaders, people who are more likely to conform to the way that they are prescribing work in the work environment. And a lot of this really comes from the place that if I hire for this specific criteria, right, this culture fit, you are, one, going to be more likely to conform to our environment. But that's important because then I would expect you to behave in a way that will give me the predicted outcomes I'm expecting. A lot of this is really about predicted success. Employers have, to some extent, preemptively decided what needs to be done to get this outcome that we're looking for. And we do see this a lot in larger, or think about, public organizations where there are defined, growth or performance expectations. And so it is the job of some people in those organizations to almost reverse engineer the equation for how do we get this outcome. And the more that we are predictive, the more that we are looking for patterns, those patterns then tend to show up in the very beginning in how we're recruiting. And so we are recruiting for people who are similarly going to come in and do what we want to do the way we want them to do it. And anybody who is going to have a challenge in conforming and behaving that way is going to potentially, risk our outcome. And so we might be less interested in that candidate. And so recruiting for culture fit does truly limit who you're bringing into your organization from a diversity perspective, from a growth perspective. And so we are really encouraging our clients to make the shift to culture add in looking at who do we have here in our organization? What are they bringing to the table? And do we have a qualified candidate who would add something different, who has unique experience, unique perspective, who thinks outside the box, who thinks and behaves in a way that is different than we are already doing. And so in recruiting and hiring for culture add, we then are able to really bring in that diversity and experience in industry and perspective, and we get innovation, we get new ideas, and we then are able to shape our culture around everyone who's a participant, as opposed to shaping the participants to fit the culture.
Yeah, well said. I think that that's such an important piece of thinking about your organization today. And so, Elena, I know I don't know if I knew you had a psychology background until today, actually, that you shared that. But I know that you have shared with me the BITE model, and I think that that's really fascinating as it relates to the workplace today. So I'd love for you to walk through it and share a bit about the different components of the BITE model.
Absolutely. So I came across the BITE model a couple of months ago, Stephen Hassan's BITE model, which is designed based on research by Robert Lifton. And the BITE model really describes 4 specific methods that cults use to maintain control over their people, their followers. And once this was introduced to me, the first thing I thought of was, there are so many applications here that apply to the professional world. And so the BITE model stands for efforts to control behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. And so Allison and I want to take you through each of these 4 structures of control. And we're going to talk a little bit about how this does show up or can show up in the corporate world, in the professional environments that we've either been in or have supported clients through. And so the first is really controlling behavior, which is, I think, the most natural, and it shows up in a lot of different ways, and not all of them are bad. We want to reiterate that, but in creating awareness to what are some of the dynamics of our organization and the outcomes that we would be looking for. So, organizations that do have structures of control that are to control behavior, some of what that looks like is really rigid rules and regulations. And so in some organizations, this is appropriate, but in other organizations, it may not need to be as extensive as it is. So do I have to be here in this place at this time, look this way, act this way, sit in this place, operate under these regulations, under all of this prescribed structure? And if I don't, what then is the result? And because of that, when you have extensive, rigid rules and regulations, more often than not, you also then have relatively extensive discipline in the professional world for employees who are not able to comply with all of those rules and regulations.
Elena, what comes to mind when I think of this is all of the times that we have looked at handbooks in organizations, and you look at a handbook, and some handbooks read as a list of punitive actions that will be taken if you breach any of these rules. Whereas others, and let me preface it, that can be appropriate in certain organizations. You work in a nuclear power plant or in the military. Yes, there are going to be very specific safety rules, regulations for which there are consequences if you don't abide by, because it could be life-threatening, right? But then you have the handbooks that have a tone that read much, I don't want to call it a softer tone, but a more relatable tone, that these are more guidelines and expectations to work within. And I think if I think about a new hire coming into an organization and reading one versus the other, that may set a different tone for their experience.
Absolutely. I think there is a line between a handbook being informational and coming off as, punitive or threatening in a sense. And so the tone is really important. The flip side of this is that you'll see this a lot in, I think, sales cultures, is the high use of rewards. So, not only do sales professionals tend to be well compensated for hitting targets, but in a lot of sales cultures, there are micro rewards. So there are contests, and you can win this and you can win that, and there are prizes and awards and titles that are all an effort to control micro behavior to get that macro result. We've said, okay, if you can have this many touches, or if you can get this many appointments in this week or this month, you're going to get all of these micro awards, and we are anticipating, right? Our expected outcome is that micro behavior will ultimately lead to closed sales to hit your macro number. But if we take a step back from that, again, that really is all about controlling so many elements of behavior in those environments.
Interesting. This next piece around information, I feel like we talk about this on a regular basis, because this is often an area that creates friction in a workplace, or can really impact team dynamics.
Absolutely. So the second piece of the BITE model is controlling information. And so we see this look a lot of different ways, Allison. We've talked about this a lot, but first and foremost, if we go back to the BITE model, and cult organizations do tend to limit access to information. And I think oftentimes professional organizations unintentionally do the same thing. And We see this in large organizations where communication is difficult, and to be able to get to the decision that was made to everybody who that decision may affect. But we also have seen this in small organizations where when there is maybe one decision maker, a lot of those decisions are made, behind one door in an executive's office, and there really isn't any information about either the decision that was made or the reason behind it. And so I think that's the other piece, is that lacking not only information, but also justification for that information, and a common understanding of how and why decisions are made.
I find that in this constantly changing work environment, some leaders feel as though they have to have all the answers or all the information buttoned up before it is actually shared. And it's not necessarily intentional that they are withholding information. But if you look at the increased demand from the employee population for transparency, particularly in times of change, there's a rub there. So we always recommend that whether you have all the answers or not, don't let that limit communication. Communicate the information that you can communicate, with the caveat, here's what I don't know, but I agree to communicate it to you when we do have that information.
I agree, Allison. I think a lot of times, especially with big projects or larger changes, employees know that things are happening, but when there isn't consistent or considered to be progressive information coming from that, I think that breeds just as much uncertainty as there being nothing, because I know the pieces are moving, I know that things are happening, but I'm not getting that same movement of information. And what's really interesting too, that you brought up transparency, is now if you think about it, like legislatively, there are calls for transparency to information, especially if you think about salary information. But in order to really do that, there then needs to be common understanding of how and why those decisions are made. So it's really interesting to see how that is evolving and is becoming really a common thread that a number of organizations are having to pull on.
I think another big piece of this is the expectation of leaders around what managers will communicate once information is communicated to them. And I think what we have seen in our work is that middle manager level really needs attention these days, and they need to understand they have so much information coming at them that intentionally or unintentionally, when they hear that information, they may not necessarily make the link or find the time to send that message as appropriate to the front lines. I know we've talked a bit about that, Elena. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. And I think a lot of times too, there's a miss at the top, in that when executive leaders are communicating down to next level leaders, I think one opportunity there is to also be somewhat prescriptive in how those next level leaders should be communicating that same or similar message to broader downline staff. And because there's not necessarily instruction, I think those second level leaders tend to hold that information, and that's how we get either compartmentalized information or we get inconsistent messaging, because one department leader might share that with their team and another departmental leader who didn't feel empowered or comfortable sharing that same message didn't share with their team. And that inconsistency can breed, a rampant distrust across the organization, because employees talk. We know this.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen that in our own work for large projects, for instance, compensation studies, right? Organizations know that pay is important to employees, so they'll do these in-depth compensation studies and then share information, but not educate managers on how to understand the findings, whatever that is, and help them be able to speak with confidence, not being an expert in compensation, but speak with confidence to the validity of the process that was used, the data that was used, or where somebody may fall. And it can create unintended outcomes that can take your best intentions of trying to make sure that you are paying competitively, and because it wasn't communicated effectively, it could have disastrous implications. As we all know, the old adage, people make, in the absence of information, people make up their own. And that's the risk that you run if you're controlling too much information and not being transparent, knowing there's a degree, right? There are varying degrees of transparency, but transparent in sharing information.
Absolutely. So the third piece of the BITE model is really controlling thoughts. And I'm sure, you're thinking, how does this have application in the professional world? But controlling thoughts really generally refers to continuously redirecting an employee's perspective. And the best example of that is thought terminating cliches, which, if you're not familiar with the concept of thought terminating cliches, trust me when I tell you, you will see them and hear them everywhere and now identify them as thought terminating cliches. But their intent is to redirect perspective and really to reduce critical thinking. And so some of the ones that we hear, and we've all been guilty of saying unintentionally or with positive intent even, one of my favorites is, it's all about balance, in which, in response to somebody sharing a concern or a frustration, what we've done is put the onus back on that person, that it is their responsibility to rebalance their workload or manage effectively, and any strain or struggle they're going through is really of their own creation and their own responsibility to solve. I think another one that really that gets me is that, try to look on the bright side. It's that positivity, which is well intended, but if it's in response to, again, a concern or something like that, it really is, it's that redirection. And so what we're unintentionally doing is stopping that employees from sharing or from asking a question, or really starting maybe questioning a decision or a process, and really redirecting them back to themselves, as opposed to continuing to introduce a new or a challenged idea to the status quo.
And I think it's important to note here, we're not suggesting that positivity, having a positive outlook on things is a bad or culty type of behavior. But if someone's response to a thought that may be contrary or challenging to your current way of thinking is immediately a go-to cliche, then that creates that dismissive, I don't really want to hear what you're thinking. Whereas you could respond with things like, tell me more, or that's interesting, tell me more about your thinking behind that. And so it's that fine line. I think it's not just because you say this, it's when you say it, the context in which you do that, and whether or not it is encouraging someone to bring forth that challenge to an idea that may create a maybe the golden nugget in solving for something, or not, helping shift thought around a process or a policy that may really need some tweaking, versus just being dismissive.
And I agree with you, Allison, that positivity has a place, encouragement has a place. Validation has a place. Toxic positivity really shows up when any negative thought communication is then criticized solely on the fact that it's negative and or different, or again, challenging an idea or a process or a policy or a decision. I think is a great example in the corporate world. So if I'm questioning a decision, maybe I didn't get information, and so I'm questioning that decision. But if my questioning is automatically perceived as negative, is really when you're in that environment of toxic positivity, where there's pressure to only think and communicate in a positive way. Again, that in itself is attempting to limit any dissonance or perceived dissonance, which is often not really a healthy environment if you are looking for an environment that is inclusive and innovative.
Great. And this one I find fascinating too, controlling emotions.
Right, which you're also probably thinking, how does this exist in the professional or the corporate world? But I really think of this in narrowing the range of acceptable feelings is how I would define the application in the professional world. So leading an employee to feel that any failure is their fault, right? It's their responsibility. They are the ones at fault, never a result of the process or the organization. It's not that they didn't have enough support. It's not that the process that was in place took too long, there was too much red tape, but really that it is their fault. They are the ones who are the failure, and they are the ones who are solely and singularly responsible for the negative outcome. I have seen that, I have experienced that, and I really think that is a classic way that some organizations, unfortunately, do make efforts to, again, narrow that range of acceptable feelings, where it relieves the organization of responsibility to that employee and alleviates the organization from being painted in a negative light.
I think where we're seeing this show up right now, real time, is in the request to return to the workplace and the real emotions that people are having about that change. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think that if we go back to that idea of fear versus trust, there is an expectation, right, that I don't trust you to continue to operate in this environment, this autonomous, virtual, in your own house environment. My expectation is that you will come back to the office and thus perform in this different way. And I think for employees to be able to say, well, wait a second, I am doing my job, I am performing, I am meeting your expectations, the outcomes are acceptable. It definitely creates an environment where there is an approach that can be made to be supportive, or there's an approach that really can be limiting. And so if we also think about narrowing that acceptable range of feelings, think about significant highs and lows. So there are certainly organizational cultures where an employee might be shown extreme and public praise, followed by a dramatic lack of attention or recognition. I put you up, I built you up, this is my employee of the month, this is our star person on this project, and then we've moved on to somebody else, and that star ceases to exist and ceases to get recognition. Oftentimes, this is a common trend in sales organizations. If you're doing well, you're publicly and consistently acknowledged. And if you may be underperforming or not hitting a number, you tend to have zero attention or recognition. And I think, again, that drastic shift really makes that employee-employer relationship unstable, because I don't know where I stand. And am I on top one day and on the bottom the other day? I think is an opportunity for organizations to, again, really identify how we want to support a culture of trust and validation.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that emotions have always been part of what an employee brings to the workplace. However, pre-pandemic, you didn't talk about that. That wasn't, you kind of leave that at the door. You come to work, you put on the happy face, and you do what you need to do. Whereas since then, there has been a shift where part of one's own well-being is that you can express and state your emotions. And when there are organizations that I don't want to use the term play with emotions, but based on what you just shared, Elena, with the excessive praise when you're doing well, and then this almost this shift to you no longer add value, that can seemingly happen overnight in some organizations. That may encourage an employee to take an action, whether they leave or they go seek outside external third parties to help them get their message across to organizations. So I'm not suggesting that that happens all the time, but I am suggesting that based on all of these structures of control that Elena has been sharing with you, and given the fact that emotions are at an all-time high and very real, that you may have unexpected outcomes that aren't what you had hoped for, if you don't pay attention to how you value or address the emotions of your employees.
And I think too, Allison, that again, those dramatic highs and lows, if I'm in a high, I'm getting validation that I'm doing the behavior that you want. And if I'm at a low, I think the intent oftentimes is to reinforce that if you behaved as I expected, you would be a high. And so if we look at this bite model, right, we are now coming full circle in those elements and those constructs of control. Mm-hmm. The last one on here, when we think about, controlling emotion and narrowing the range of acceptable feeling, is that sense that there's never a legitimate reason to leave. And a lot of times this really looks like ostracizing those who left, blaming those who left, or my personal favorite, not acknowledging those who quit.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's really a cultural myth for organizations. People leave for a whole variety of reasons, but helping them and helping them as they enter an organization, get up to speed, and exit an organization, so that for whatever reason is equally as important, right? So even if they leave not on their own terms, but they should be able to exit respectfully with their head held high. And if they're exiting because they have found a different opportunity or an opportunity for growth and development, celebrating the time that they have spent with you and the value that they have added to the team or the organization is really important. And it doesn't happen that way across all organizations.
Right. And I think sometimes the intent of that behavior is that we don't want to promote leaving. We want to keep everyone here, but do we really want to keep people here in that type of environment? Mm-hmm. And is that an environment that your organization wants to represent?
Mm-hmm. That really, that to me defines very clearly that spectrum of culture to Culty, right? How you treat the exiting professionals.
Mhm.
So if we think about everything we've spoken about today and some takeaways for ways that you can adapt your workplace culture, go back to what we said in the beginning. This was not intended to suggest that anybody who's listening here that your culture is culty. However, it is intended to suggest that sometimes over time we build in practices into our culture or they evolve into our culture that make it uh, that, that move it on that spectrum. And given the fact that the employee experience has changed and what employees are expecting, it's time for you to kind of rethink. So think about the cultural, think about just even the language and the mindset of when you're recruiting for talent, think cultural add versus cultural fit. That's a great place to start. Not, oh, I don't want him or her because it doesn't seem like a culture fit. What does that really mean? Tell me more about that, and really try to understand. And close don't close the door on opportunity to bring in new perspectives, new ideas, new experiences.
And I think when it comes to behavior, where you can, embrace autonomy. I think organizations have a unique opportunity, especially in the new dynamics of the workplace, to lead with trust. Lead with trust that employees understand their expectations and will perform responsibly and make decisions, as that are authentic to the anticipated and ideal outcomes of your organization, and address where needed. But leading with trust, I think, is a great way to start. When we think about information, share whatever you can as consistently and regularly as possible. And when you can't share, which we absolutely recognize is going to happen, share why you can't, or set expectations for when you will have additional communication and what that might look like.
I might add too, and you mentioned it when we were speaking about this, is make sure your managers are well trained and that the expectations around what they can share and what they should share is clearly stated. Don't make the assumption that they know exactly how to share information with confidence.
Oh, that's a great point, Allison. When it comes to thoughts, we definitely want to come to the table with an open mind and make sure that we are validating what we are hearing from our employees, whether that is an idea, a concern, questioning a decision or a policy or a process, but making sure that we are being receptive and responsive to all of those things that are voiced by our staff with genuine interest, and not just saying, yes, I'll hear you out, but but truly being receptive and being genuine in those interactions. I think the other thing I would add here is that when we think about, thought control and employee perspective, making sure that a lot of organizations tend to really push to, get to buy in, to be part of the team, to live, breathe, our organization's mission. And that push might be perceived or could have downstream effects of, again, limiting an employee's perspective to your organization and your path. And that's really common to internalizing organizational doctrine, which is what cults do. And so while there's absolutely a place for, your mission and your vision and being part of the team, I think we also need to be open-minded and flexible to hearing, new ideas and letting employees decide what walking their path toward your mission or vision looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And lastly, from an emotional perspective, consistently supporting your employees in feeling seen, valued, and supported. So consistent recognition, making sure that they feel like they have a consistent place here, that they are seen, that they are valued, and that they have support. They can express challenges and will be supported and not, ostracized or made to feel like they are the only one that can solve their professional challenges, whether those are performance related, developmental related, or otherwise.
And this is a shift in how managers were taught to manage. They weren't taught to, generally speaking, to address emotions in a healthy way. It was just kind of one of those things. No, that's not my job. It is their job. So helping them understand, how do you do that in a professional manner, and how do you respond to someone who's expressing anger or sadness or any of the emotions that they may be faced with today in a healthy, productive manner. So we hope that this serves as a foundation for you to think about your own organizations and the processes and policies and practices that you have in place, and how you might want to tweak them a bit to ensure that they stay relevant. For part 2 of this, and we will be sending out the exact date in the next week or so, we're going to go a little bit deeper and talk about, so how do you apply this to unpacking exclusively inclusive cultures? We talked a little bit today about cultural fit. Well, are we truly being inclusive if we exclude certain types of people because we don't believe that they fit within our organization? So this is going to be very interesting. We're going to talk about conformity is not inclusive, and then engagement versus participation. So we hope that leaves you with a little bit of intrigue as to where this conversation may go. And we want to thank, I want to thank Elena, first of all, for bringing this idea to the table. And we want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day to join. We hope that you found this of value. And we look forward to seeing you on the next the next episode of this When Culture Gets Culty. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.